Mark chapter 10. And we're glad you're here, Mary Ann, even if you're late. Yes. We're glad you're here. And we'll pray that your tummy's doing better too. And if you leave, we'll understand. So we're in Matthew chapter 10. Jesus teaching us about who he is and also about the ways of the kingdom. And he's trying to set some things straight with the folks there. And you can see from the message title, For Better or For Worse, you would hear in a marriage ceremony. And I just wondered how many people think about the for worse side. I think they get the for better, but what about the for worse? Because it can happen, right? And anyhow, we're living in an age where the breakdown of the family and moving away from the moral values we've stood for as a church in the country is slowly killing our nation. And that's Satan's plan, right? To break up the family. And so to break that up, he breaks up the marriage relationship. And one of the most devastating factors is the rampant and ravenous sin of divorce. And now, I'm not knocking divorcees. I'm one of those. Doesn't make it right. And I was unsaved, but it still doesn't make it right in God's eyes. But, you know, there's one thing nice about in Jesus, there's hope for everyone. And so I just want to set that up front. But it was a real problem in the Jewish nation, and it's a real problem in the church in America today. At one time, the world's divorce rate was much higher than the church's divorce rate, but that's not true anymore. And that's sad. Many of us have experienced it or have been affected by it. And I think we see the effects upon the children that have now grown into adults in our society. How many kids, and I'm going to tell you this, hats off to single parents. I want to say that there. But how many kids have been raised in our country with a single parent because of divorce? And that's hard, and it has an effect upon them. And we're reaping, if you would say, the benefits of that. Remember, what you sow, you always reap. And so we see that. And many of us experienced it. And I'm not knocking it, but what should our thinking be on divorce? And so that's what Jesus is going to teach us today, what God's intention for the marriage relationship is and was. And always will be. And it doesn't change. Our rules and our laws here change, but God's rules and laws never change. And this was his ideal. And so he's in verse 1, he's teaching. And then he arose from there and came to the region of Judea by the other side of the Jordan. And the multitudes gathered to him again. And as he was accustomed, he taught them again. So Jesus, whenever he got a crowd, guess what he did? He taught them. He was a great teacher. And so always remember this. When you have a question, go to the great teacher. He has the answers. Now, I can give answers. Other Christians can give answers. But Jesus' answers are always perfect. And so that's what he's going to do. He's going to teach them. And so here's the question. And a little bit background there. Jesus had completed his ministry in Galilee, left Capernaum, and now he came to the Transjordan area on his way to Jerusalem. Remember, he's heading to Jerusalem because you know what's going to happen there, right? He's going to go to the cross and he's going to die for our sins and is buried and rise again. But this area was ruled by Herod Antipas. He's the one who had John the Baptist jailed and then later what? Beheaded. But you know why he didn't like John the Baptist? Because he had married his brother's wife. And John called him an adulterer. He said, "You got your brother's wife." And so he didn't like that very well, because even with that, he was afraid of John because of what the people thought of him, but his wife was not. And she is the one that really asked, remember the daughter, dance for him? And then he said, well, he got too many drinks under the belt, you know. And he said, I'll just give you anything you want, up to half the kingdom. And she runs back to Mom. Mom says, I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And that's what happened to John the Baptist. And so, but they, neither one of them liked it that John called it the way it is. Now, those kind of prophets and preachers and stuff today are getting less. There's not as many ready to stand up and call sin for what it is, right? And it's not pretty. But we all, and remember, we're living under the sun. Praise God, there's forgiveness for things that have taken place in our life. And we'll look at that as we go on. Here's the question. The Pharisees came and asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife, testing him? So that word tested there means to ensnare, to trap. They weren't really looking for an answer. They were looking at some way to ensnare Jesus, to trap him, because they want to what? They want to get rid of him. Even though he's healing the blind, he's raising the dead, he's healing the sick, the Pharisees and them do not like him. The religious system of that time, they don't like him. Now, a few of them get saved out of that, Nicodemus and those kind of things, but as a whole, they don't like him. It was a trick question because divorce was a very controversial question at that time. It was a controversial subject with Jewish rabbis. That's because there was two thoughts. And we'll look at Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4 in a minute. But it says there that a husband could write a bill of divorce for the wife. In the New American Standard, it says some indecency, the NIV. It'll say for some uncleanness in her in the New King James Version. New Living Testament says something was wrong with her. So Rabbi Hillel had this, he's the quiet, lenient kind of guy. He's a liberal. And he permitted a man to divorce his wife for any reason. Even if she burnt the toast, he could divorce her. And then we had Rabbi Shammai, Shammai, and he was more strict. And he taught the only time you could divorce someone was if they had an affair or immorality in the betrothal period. Now remember, their weddings weren't quite like ours. Their mom and dad would set up a marriage relationship and they would kind of like sign a covenant. And that was called the betrothal period. And during this betrothal period, they still were considered husband and wife even though they hadn't become husband and wife yet. And you can go back to the story of Mary and Joseph there, and you'll see that happening there in that same situation. And he said that if they did some sexual act of immorality during that betrothal period, they could get married. Otherwise, they were stuck in their marriage relationship. So Jesus is going to give them an answer. And that's in verses 3 through 8. And he answered, this was a really hard outline. There's the question, here's the answer. And it says, and he answered and said to them, what did Moses command you? And here we go. It says, they said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her. And Jesus, another, answered and said to them, why? Because of the hardness of your own heart, he wrote you this precept. But, that's one of my favorite Bible words, but. From the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Now, see, right there is already going to mess up a lot of things accepted in our culture today. Male, female. And so it's pretty clear. There is a reason it's male and female. Because in Genesis, God told them to what? Go out and procreate. And fill the earth with people that knew and loved him. And we know they failed in that too, but there we go. But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. He takes them all the way back to Genesis. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then that they are no longer two, but one flesh. So, what did Moses say? I want you to turn back to Deuteronomy. That's way back there in the white pages. And Deuteronomy 24. It's right before Joshua. If you get too far back, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And they'll find it in 24. And here's the passage that they had to work with. That the Pharisees, remember the Pharisees and the scribes were legalistic in their understanding of Scripture. They knew the legal sides of Scripture. It says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her. Like I said, the NIV says some indecency. The New Living Translation says there's something wrong with her. And that's left up to his interpretation. What was wrong with her? You know, there's no specifics here. And that's the sad part. I read through a list at one time of what a guy could divorce his wife for. It's incredible. The things that they put in there. And I don't know about you, but you know, now my wife's a wonderful cook. My wife is a wonderful cook. And my first wife could burn water. And she was not, I guess that's why I got rid of her. Anyhow. And he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts her in her hand, and sends her out of this house. When she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, so she's free to remarry. If the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, if the second one doesn't like her and gets rid of her, puts it in her hand, sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God has given you as an inheritance. A lot of things in that verses we could preach on, but we see that if the man wanted to divorce his wife for whatever this word means, uncleanness or indecency or something you don't like, and that was left up to the interpretation of the rabbis. One rabbi strict, one rabbi lenient. It's not a lot different than in things today. Of course, in America today, you can have a no-fault divorce, right? That's really a lie, 'cause somebody's fault there. But anyhow, you can divorce someone for about any reason. You don't have to have a reason, right? You just file for divorce. So that's the lenient side, and then the strict side would be, as we'll be looking at. But Jesus went back there, and if you divorced them, which, now I want to say this, do you see that who could divorce who? Man could divorce the woman, but the woman didn't have the right to divorce a man in Israel's culture. So, and we'll see Jesus work on this thought too in just a moment. And so, she did have 3 situations that she could divorce her husband. Number 1, if he became a leper. She could divorce him if he became a leper, or if he ravished a virgin. Number 3, falsely accused her of prenuptial sin. So those 3 reasons she could, but that probably never happened very much. But Roman women did have the right to divorce their husband. And you see a little bit difference in cultural situations, and you know that we are really affected by Roman culture in our world today, as we are of that Gentile descent. Second, the official bill of divorcement was given to the wife to declare her status to ensure any prospective husband that she is indeed free to remarry. It was a simple bill of divorcement. Here it is. It started out. And this is in the King James. So, let this be from me thy writ of divorce and letter of dismissal and deed of liberation, that thou mayest marry whatsoever man thou wilt. Otherwise, when she was out from him, she could marry whoever she decided to marry. And she's free to do that. This would free her from committing, as Jesus will say later, adultery. And so then later it became more long. I guess they probably gave it to lawyers. Because lawyers, you know, when they write stuff up, I read that and I'm going, what? It's long and it doesn't really say any more than that one sentence did, but here's what it is. Later it became more elaborate. On the 20th day of the 40th week of the 10th month, year 2000 whatever, Yasser Rabban, and son of Jeremiah Rabban, and by whatsoever name I am called here, present this day, the 20th, native of the town of Capernaum, acting on my free will, without any coercion, do repudiate, send back, and put away thee, Abigail Rabban, daughter of Alim Hassan, so that thou art free, and thou canst at thy pleasure marry whom thou wilt, and no one will hinder thee. This is thy letter of divorce, act of repudiation, certificate of separation according to the law of Moses and Israel. All that to say that she's divorced and she's free. So there you go. That's the only thing I can think of. This protected her from adultery in their eyes. Apart from the giving of this document, the only other requirement was that the woman not return to her what? Her first husband. And so the question is again, was not, could a divorced woman marry again? The big question was, what are the grounds for a man to divorce his wife? And so that's where we're back in Mark. And he said that it was because of their hard hearts. The law of Moses originally gave no grounds for divorce. The law of Moses gave no grounds for divorce. Otherwise, it was as it was in Genesis, right? One man, one woman, forever. That's ideal. That's the ideal. And I know many of us here have not followed the ideal pattern. Some of us here, let's just put it that way. I won't say many. Some of us here. And there are some reasons that you can get a divorce that are legal in God's eyes, and we'll look at those in just a few minutes. In Israel, remember what happens if you committed adultery? Remember the woman and Jesus writing in the sand? And they were going to take her out and what? Now the funny thing there, if you knew the law of Deuteronomy, guess who's missing? They said they caught her in the act of adultery. She's there, but where's the man? See, that was really another setup to get Jesus to find something to accuse him. And remember, he starts writing in the sand. He says, whoever has no sin, cast the first stone. And remember, the older guy's going, uh-oh. Now, finally, the youngest leaves, and here she is. Now, Jesus doesn't set her free. He says, don't you sin anymore. And so I don't know what all was going on there, but Jesus had compassion upon that woman, and he had a reason for that. But he said, you have a hard heart, and it was never in the law, so Moses permitted it. You know, there are reasons that people get divorced, but you don't have to get a divorce. The Bible will set up three that we'll look at in a moment, but that doesn't mean you have to get a divorce. It means you can get a divorce. It's permitted. It's not the ideal, but it sometimes happens, and there it goes. And we'll look at those. And I'm going to tell you, I've seen some some bad situations that I think the best thing was divorce. I have never counseled anybody that I know of to get a divorce, but I wouldn't have blamed a couple that did. Because I believe that God says one man, one woman in His Word, and that's our goal. But as we know, we live in a fallen world, and it doesn't always happen the way that it should be. And so he said, your hearts were hard. You refused to accept God's view of marriage. The law protected the wife by restraining the husband from just divorcing her for any reason. But that got changed by man's word and his translation of that word. By giving this commandment to Israel, God was not putting His approval on divorce. Moses acknowledged the presence of divorce in Israel, but he didn't institute it or authorize it. Divorce would be unnecessary if hearts were pure and sinless, right? Because there's always a reason behind two people not wanting to be together. And there's always a reason. That's why I said the no-fault law is not really correct. Jesus took them back to Moses and to Genesis. And he says they become one. That word there, one, is described by gluing two pieces of paper together. Try tearing it apart. Some parts go this side, some parts goes on that side. And that's what happens when those people are divorced. Part of you goes with that person, and part of that person goes with you. That's what he's telling us there. He says, you leave your father and mother, and I was just talking with Rhonda's daughter, whom I'm getting ready to do a wedding for. And she said, well, that leaving father and mother thing, I'm kind of old for that one. I said, but it's telling you this, you are now starting a home, and you're responsible as two adults for this family unit. Your mom and dad are not responsible for you any longer, even though they probably have not been responsible for her for a little while. And but that's what it's talking about, leaving and what? Cleaving. And you cleave to that. And now sometimes that's really hard in a family unit, because sometimes you have mama's boy and you have daddy's girl. And they're so used to dad telling them what to do or mom telling them what to do that it's really hard for them to make decisions on their own. And now you got to own up to it. Those decisions are on you. And you make those decisions on what's going to go on in your family and all those kind of things. And you know, you hear comments like, well, mom didn't do it that way. Dad didn't do it like that. Well, you know what? That's really nothing to say at all. It's what does your husband do, or what does your wife do now? This, you know, mom didn't cook it that way. She never burned it like that. She may have at one time. You weren't around to see it, right? and like I said, some people have learned to cook and some haven't. And like I'm a living witness to my wife is a good cook. I was a skinny thing when she met me. Now I can't get one leg in the size pants I wore back then. And so I'm not going to divorce her. She may kill me, but I'm not going to divorce her. And so God established marriage. And so that's what Jesus said. God said it's pretty simple. Go back to Genesis, there you are, and it tells you what the marriage relationship is supposed to be. And it goes on to say that they were naked and not ashamed. And that means they were intimately entwined. Not only physically, but intimately. Two couples that are now what? One. Now, do they always think alike? No. And if you know men and women, they never think alike too much because they think differently.
Repeat that.
I said men and women are never completely alike mentally. Because you know why it is? Because women and men think from different sides of their brains. That's the way God made them. So what? They would make a good what? Unit. Isn't that great? God had a special. Women are more emotional than men are. Not always. Most of the time. Men are more factual. That's pretty easy. That's black and white. The woman says, no, it's not. It's gray. And she starts crying. You know, she knows how to use those tears. And she knows how to work her way into your heart. And you know, and then you talk about daughters and sons. Daughters wrap their dads around their fingers pretty young age. And they use that. And like I said, when I was in Bible college, I took notes, Shirley took notes. You would have thought we sat in different classes. Couldn't believe it. I said, where did you get that at? Like I said, the tests were under my notes, so that's what counted, even though she did wonderful in school too. So he said, marriage is not a contract of temporary convenience. He says, 1 + 1 = 1. You say, well, that's not good math. That's God's math, right? Remember? 1 + 1 = 1. You are now one two flesh become one. And he said, so I want this marriage, this contract is supposed to be for life, because it goes on in verse 9, which most folks have probably had read in their marriage ceremony. Therefore, for what man has joined together, whatever God has joined together, let not man put what? Asunder. And so there it is. It says, therefore, that means it's supposed to be for how long? Forever. That's his goal. So Jesus said that it's supposed to be monogamous, heterosexual, and permanent one flesh relationship. So there we go. Since marriage is a physical union, only a physical cause can break it. Romans 7, we won't turn there. You can turn there if you want to at some time. Paul says, if your spouse dies, you have the privilege to remarry. Man or woman. And that was one thing also that Jesus will say here in a minute. We'll see, we'll get to that. That he also gives the woman the right, the same right as a man, to divorce, even though it wasn't legal in Israel's law. Sexual immorality, it says, and Jesus teaching again in Matthew chapter 5 and Matthew chapter 19, he says that we're supposed to be a one flesh, except if there is sexual immorality. Now, that is the word porneia. That includes a whole lot of things. Homosexual relationship. It's really talking about any sexual intimacy of any kind outside the marriage relationship. Anything. And so he says that would be, and it is talking about a habitual, if you check the Greek out, it's a habitual thing. It's not a one-time thing. Now, I'm guaranteed one-time thing can destroy a marriage relationship. It breaks trust and bonds that's hard to build back. But it's talking there more about someone who is a repeated offender. And this is a lifestyle for them. And you may know people that on both sides of the coin, man or female, that have problems keeping their love life in line. Let's just put it that way. And so there is that sexual immorality. That can be. And then the last one, Paul says, is about an unbelieving partner. Two people are married, and one of them gets saved. And he says they're number one. If the husband or the wife that's unsaved wants to stay married, guess what? Stay married. He said there's a great chance that you might be able to lead that other person to the Lord. He doesn't say it always works, but he says it could happen. And he says, but if that unbelieving person says, I don't want anything more to do with you, you are nuts. That church stuff and that money stuff and all that stuff, I don't want to be involved in that. And they say, I'm out of here. You know what Paul said? Let them go. Let them go. And you're free, what? To remarry. You're free to remarry. Now, we knew my wife's niece. She belonged to it was more of a cult than a church. She's finally got out of that. She married a guy, and they consummated their marriage, let's just put it that way, and then he left her. He just was done. No reason, he just left. So that church believed that now she was supposed to stay single the rest of her life. I didn't see it that way, in my opinion, but I understood where they got that, because really if he didn't go out and have a sexual relationship with someone, there was really no adultery, no sexual immorality. He's still alive apparently. And so that was a hard one. So I'm going to leave that with you and your convictions of what you would have said to do there. I told her that she ought to remarry. And she never has. She's still single. And that's been lots of years. And so, see, we mess it up no matter what the rules are. That's just the way it is. Thank God for His grace. Mark did not include the exception clause, but he didn't say anything about death either. So it's there. Then so here we go. We finish this up a little bit. And he's going to teach. The disciples are still trying to process all this. And so in verses 10 through 12, he gives them private teaching. In the house, his disciples also asked him again about the same matter. So he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And then he promotes the woman here and says, if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So he's talking about if you do it beyond scriptural bounds, that you are committing adultery when you married another. And it doesn't have the exception clause. So we were in a church in Indiana, wonderful pastor there, and then they got a new pastor, and his name was John, great fella. But his decision was that if you got divorced, you couldn't remarry. And so we had a couple there that he had been through a divorce. They were very big and prominent in the church, very godly man, and he had remarried not long before this pastor came. Matter of fact, the previous pastor married him. And so this pastor preached out of this passage, and he says, if you've divorced and remarried, you've committed adultery. So he came to me and his wife. We were friends with them. He's a builder. He said, what do I do? What do I do? I said, well, we didn't talk about the exception clause. Why did you get a divorce? He said, my wife was having an affair with another man. And as a matter of fact, they're now married. I said, well, I see that as a scriptural reason for the divorce. Isn't that right? That's sexual immorality. That's on her now. And so he's free. So he said, well, what am I to do? I said, go talk to the pastor. I said, don't start out here. You need to go see him and settle this issue. And then when he got done with the pastor went on, and he didn't have any problem with what had taken place. He knew the exception clause there. He just didn't preach on it in this passage because it what? It didn't have it in this passage. But you got to be careful there. New Tribes Mission, 360, whatever it is now. It's got a new name. But anyhow, they're out teaching tribal people that if you've had more than one wife, you can't become a deacon or an elder. So the tribal guy says, okay. He goes out and he kills one wife. He says, now I just have one. That happened, literally. That happened. You got to be careful that you don't preach all the stuff, you know. And this is what happened. And he come back in. He told the missionary, he said, yep. He said, I'm only have one. I can become an elder now. I only have one wife. He said, what did you do with the other wife? He said, well, I killed her and buried her over there, you know. I told you we mess it up no matter what the thing is. That's what the old sin nature. And so in closing here, and so then he tells them there again this statement. In Matthew it says in 19:10, I wrote it down so we didn't have to look there. It says, after he explained that marriage is what? Permanent for life. His disciples said this, and when he taught on it in Matthew 19, if such is the case of the man with his wife, it's better not to marry. Isn't that really where we need to lead people? If you can't commit to a lifetime relationship, then the best thing is what? Don't get married. Don't get married. Because you know what? You're not perfect. She's not perfect. And you're going to put two people together that have been brought up different under different ways and different things, and it's not going to always run smooth. Let's just put it that way. And so I have in one of my counseling things, how to have a good fight. You're going to have one once in a while. I don't know about you. I've not had very many, but I've had a couple. And a couple of them been doozies. And I'm still alive. We're still married. And you all could tell us here, you know, it's like that man that was married for 80 years or 60 years, I guess it was, and asked him how to do it. And he said, we always decided that if we got in a real big disagreement that I would take a walk. He says, I'm going to tell you, I've been an outdoors man. And but he says again there that God's design was to put us together and let not man separate. Too many people see divorce as the easy way out. And really, it opens up the door for sexual immorality. Because so many of those people, both sides of the coin, have already got their eyes on somebody else. And there's something else is going on. And I've watched it in the workplace. I've been offered it in the workplace. And it's out there. And then, well, it's easy. You just pay for it. Especially if you don't have children. But if you have children, it's not so easy. That's a painful thing. I went through it, and it was ugly. Then I ended up raising my girls. And praise God for that opportunity. Who now call my wife their mom. And who they relate to highly because of her relationship with them. We became one flesh and our kids became one family. But was it God's ideal? No, it wasn't. But I thank God for grace and mercy. And were there problems because of that? Oh boy. And I've watched it in kids, how they use that divorced parent against the other divorced parent. And it becomes ugly. Or they tell the new parent like this, well, you ain't my mom. You ain't my dad. You can't tell me what to do. And you know what I do to kids like that? I remind them who I am with the belt on their rear end. So, but you can't hardly do that today in today's society. You got to be careful with those things because now social services will come and suck them right out of your house. And we were having some ice cream, which is one of my favorite sports, at Sand Lake Party Store. And we come out there, and here's the Amish lady and her little one. Beautiful blue-eyed little guy, but who needed to be reminded who's boss around here. And he's throwing some fits. And I'm thinking, man. And Dad came out, but when Dad came out, Mom and him were gone. I take it that she took him out to the buggy. And reminded him who's boss. Because you have to do it in private, and there's nothing wrong with that. But she dealt with it, I'm sure. Then finally, he went, and then he came back and finished eating, and then he left. And so I don't know the whole story, and I didn't hear the screeching and crying and agony and all that, so I don't know. But that's what should have been done in that situation. But doing that with someone else's kid, now, and I, even though we become adoptive parents and all those things, which happened to my family, it's hard to really treat them as they're what? Your own. And every one of my kids are my own. I had I have one adopted son, and I had 2 grandkids that I adopted, a son and a daughter. But I don't see them as my grandkids, and I don't see that as my adopted son. They're my kids. And I became their dad, and it became my responsibility. But that's still hard to do, and there's things to work through. But that's what happened. That's why God says in Malachi, I hate divorce. If you want to see his opinion, Malachi 3:16. I hate divorce. Why? Because it causes all kinds of problems in a family. And then Satan gets his foot in there, and he causes problems, and now we have the world we have today, right? And as I said, a lot of times people don't understand. I believe a lot of people never got their butts whooped. And they became politicians. When I see some of the fits they run, I said, man, your mama never got a hold of you. Or your daddy never got a hold of you because you wouldn't be saying that. And I watched a couple of those during a couple of those riots where mama got a hold of a couple of those boys and she jerked them out of there and said, I'm going to slap your face off. And I may be a little, but maybe he needed it. And but I think some adults need to be jerked by the ear and get their faces slapped off too at the things they do, and expect people to believe it and forgive it. I tell you what, to come in and tell your wife, well, I've been having a relationship for blah, 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 and it's been with another guy. Or that this one, and there's a lot of it going on today, the wife comes in and says, I'm having a relationship, and guess what? It's another woman. Can you imagine what that does to your insides? I can't imagine that. I went through it once, and I would never want to go through it again. It made me rethink the whole marriage thing. Even as an unsaved person, Shirley and I were unsaved when we got married. I got divorced on a weekday, and I got married on that weekend. And I've been married for 43 years. It's a wonderful thing. I got married in a little chapel over there and laughed through my wedding. My wife still doesn't know what was wrong with me, but she still kept me. And we had some unique things happen. The best man kissed the maid of honor. And that wasn't in the script. And her boyfriend didn't think it should be either. And but that's the way it goes. So with all that, it's serious business. Marriage is a serious business. And I like to install that. And when I talk with couples, I try to make sure we understand this is a commitment, folks. And I'd like to tell you that every wedding I did is still together. It's not. It's not true. But God will deal with that issue. Let's